My name is Will Hammonds. I've been working at Universities UK for the last year or so, and during this time I've been working on the Scenarios project that has been run out of the longer term strategy network that has been chaired by Paul O'Prey. It's been an opportunity for us to take stock of all the factors that have been going on and shaping higher education over the last year and into the future. And as part of this, we've run a number of workshops, and this presentation is the presentation that we've been using as part of this. The presentation provides a group with lots of information about factors that we see shaping higher education, puts a bit of a narrative on it as well, and it's intended to provide a little bit of space and prompts for a group to start having a conversation about what they think are important factors and what are the critical uncertainties that are in there that might be shaping higher education and the implications for their own institution. Okay, so moving on. Broadly, the presentation is structured around three main issues: the funding of higher education, unsurprisingly, demand for higher education, and also innovation and evolution in higher education, and that's set out on slide 3. Slide 4, this slide has been provided to us by our consultants IDENC, who had been working with us through the project, and this illustrates quite nicely, I think, the process that we've been through. The middle three boxes, now, and also what the lock-ins are, what are the big decisions that are going to be happening in the next 3 to 5 years, and the longer term drivers. Now I think this is what I'm putting up in the presentation. Obviously I'm testing this out with the group, and it's intended as an opportunity for discussion and reflection. It's not a statement of fact by any stretch of the imagination. And then you can see the decisions underneath. Now I think this is where we start looking for the group to start looking at what are the big decisions that institutions are going to be taking, what are the big decisions for the sector. Now, like I said, we're not in the business of predictions, but it's a bit of creative thinking, and this comes out on the right hand side of the slide as well. I think this is the second half of the workshop. It's an opportunity for the group to put a bit of creative thinking together, once looking at all of these factors and looking at all these decisions. What are the sort of outcomes that we see, and really once you start looking at the potential outcomes and these creative pictures, you start being able to pick apart what is it that you value, what are your priorities into the future. And I think that's a very important part of this workshop and this exercise. Moving on, slide 5. I think these are very important points to consider for the group as we go through this. There are questions for the institution, and how they might shape the world. But there are also sort of points to think about as you go through this, and it helps you really try and take yourself out of the here and now. Think about other sectors. 30 years ago, let's say. Who have changed out of all recognition? Think about telecoms, for example. This isn't from personal experience, but my understanding, from the 1980s, you had one telephone provider, one sort of telephone, and you paid for each call. Now you have mobile phone providers, landline providers, cable providers, and you have different talk plans, different handsets, and you can mix and match whatever you want. Very different. Then who's starting to change now? The music industry is a good example here. All their content has gone digital, and all of a sudden, their revenue models have just evaporated. And what are the implications for that? What are bands having to do now to try and get their music out there and even make a living, let's say? Then there's also the black swans as well. What are the big events that might come along, unexpectedly or semi-expectedly, that may really sort of change what it is that we're dealing with into the future. So that's the kind of setup. That's what we're trying to achieve with this presentation. Opportunity for discussion, reflection. It's really intended to get the critical and creative juices going, and to try and take the group out of the here and now. So now, we can move on. Slide 6, title slide. How do we start developing this picture? What are the key factors that we think are shaping? But we felt that when we were doing this exercise, it's worthwhile starting with a little bit of history, just to reflect on where we've come from. So slide 7 just sort of sets out some of the features that we thought really characterised higher education. And you may disagree, but in practice we saw a sector that residential 3-year models, demand outstripping supply, with supply which is heavily regulated, and that really, is a university structure, 3-year residential degree model that tends to be the main format of which that we understand when talking about higher education. Then there's slide 8. Now this is a very important slide. This shows the pattern, the changing patterns of funding. It shows the decrease in per unit funding during the 90s and during the 1990s, and then it shows the rebalancing of funding into higher education. Well, the increase in per unit funding into higher education, but that increase being directed via the student, and that's the trend that we've been on over the last decade or so. Moving on, this is where we are at this moment in time. What we have is an agenda to liberalise the market. We've already seen the ability of universities to set higher fees liberalised, so there's potentially more scope for price differentiation, although the degree to which that has happened. We're also trying to see a degree of supply side liberalisation as well, with the introduction of new suppliers, and this emphasis on the idea of competition driving demand-led ideas of quality as well. And there's also this very important point, I think, it's around the introduction of an amendable mechanism to constrain taxpayer liability to the cost of individuals going through higher education as well. And we'll come back onto that in a little bit. But if we take it that, at least the intention is there to liberalise the market, and that the likelihood, whilst, the current reforms may not be quite exactly how they originally intended, they are a step in that sort of direction. Once you see, introducing new suppliers, introducing new regulation, here are some of the lessons on slide 10 that we can draw from other sectors that have been through processes of liberalisation. We might expect new entrants, particularly from overseas. We might expect some sort of innovation, around the pricing or the sorts of offers that organisations are offering to their customers. We'll definitely see new forms of regulation, as we can already see in relation to higher education, because there needs to be new mechanisms put in place to protect the consumer and also to achieve public goods and public interest outcomes as well. And certainly, I think we'll find new forms and sources of funding, and even takeovers, I guess. And I think that's something you probably see from the energy market as well. But one of the big assumptions that we make throughout this presentation, and I think that drives our understanding of the future, is that there's likely to be a continued growth for higher education. Now, we set this out on slide 11. Now, this is a very grand assumption, and the group may want to take a very different view on this. But I think our view comes from a sense that post-industrial economic development in the UK, Western Europe, Western world, increasing needs for a higher level of skills as the entry point into the labour market. We also see a growing middle class in developing economies, which again we know brings greater demands for higher level skills, and those economies want to move into more knowledge-based phases of development as well. And we also see around us and in our own working lives, so this data-rich sort of knowledge world. I don't know about knowledge world, but this idea that you need to keep on learning throughout your career and to be adaptable to new changes in the world around you. And it's not just a job for life in one place. And what we felt really was that that's likely to underpin, sort of long-term, ongoing growth in demand for high-level skills. Okay, so depending on what the group feels, whether we are in for continued growth in demand for higher education, maybe this is a picture of the future. So looking at slide 12, this is an example of a deregulated market experiencing significant growth in demand. This is, in fact, a chart that shows the increasing overseas non-EU domiciled students being enrolled into the UK. And over the last decade it's doubled. It's not to say the UK has necessarily expanded its market share significantly, and rising tide floats all boats, as a famous person says. But this is an example of the possibilities that are out there for a sector that is able and free to go and meet emerging patterns of demand and take an excellent product overseas. So after the rosy picture on slide 12, we've got the reality check. I guess we all know there's going to be long-term funding pressures, as described ably by the Office of Budget Responsibility and Moody's on slide 13. And likewise on slide 14, we've got another depressing slide that suggests that we're in for a long period of pretty poor growth. The extent to which that affects universities, or whether there are other opportunities for identifying funding, I don't know. But I think the main picture, the main story that we've got at present is this big shift in undergraduate funding. This slide here illustrates the degree to which we're moving on to a loans-based funding system, a fees-based funding system backed by government loans. And I guess a big question here is the degree to which that changes things. The red part is still a lot of public money in there, but it is being directed from the student. And it is interesting to hear from the group what that slide means to them. But also the degree to which we might expect the blue proportion of that slide to return. We also have some other significant questions coming up at present and in the very near future and in the medium term when looking at slide 16. There are obviously the short-term decisions. The white paper illustrates this, and the degree to which, pricing decisions of universities encourages a certain response out of government. But what we do know is within all of these, even in a positive environment, although financially straitened times, there are always going to be ongoing pressures for universities. And this slide 17, just captures a couple of the quick points that I think will be keeping universities on their toes, let's say, over the coming years. And I think these are probably the same things that have been sort of driving the interest of universities over the last few years. It's customer satisfaction. Are your students happy? Will they be pleased with what they come and experience during their time at university? Will they get a fulfilling and productive experience? Are your staff satisfied professionally? How much volume and quality of research does that require? And also there's this whole, it's the competition point, but it's this idea of world-class status and the degree to which that continues to drive cost inflation. It's almost like in the Premier League or something, and players' wages being driven by the need to finish top. This little slide here is just an interesting slide, I felt, that is worth including and is useful to even touch on, in fact. This is patterns of tuition growth from the United States. What it shows is that until 2007, it was running at 6% per annum, dropping to 5.3% per annum. But what the green proportion of that graph shows you is the change in net worth of households, the ability of people effectively to take out loans against their property to go to university. Now you can see the massive drop in 2008, and that's the start point of all our economic woes at present. But what we also see is that whilst it's slowed growth, it is still growth. So in 2010 it dropped to 2.6% growth, but come 2011 it's still increasing back to 2.7%. What that means I don't know, and obviously we're not the United States, but I've just found that quite interesting. This then moves us on to the second phase of this. After looking at the financial models of funding into UK higher education and the economic situation in which we're in, I think then it takes us to the other major factor that's going to be shaping higher education over the foreseeable future, and I already illustrated it in the growth in non-EU students. So moving on to slide 19, what we have here is the figures produced by HESA for 2009-10. This is overseas students on UK higher education provision and their location of study. And what we've already got in 2009-2010 are overseas students on UK provision overseas outstripping the number of students from overseas in the UK. Now, this obviously isn't a trend. This is only the first or second year of collecting these sort of statistics, but I think that really illustrates the degree to which a sector such as higher education and the demand that there is going to be overseas, and the phenomenal demand really as economies such as China and India develop and direct, and send more people through a higher level of higher education. The opportunities that there are for UK universities to take over, the knowledge, the expertise, and their abilities to help, support the development of higher education overseas. So, moving on to chapter 20. Slide 20 even. Again, this slide just illustrates where we are going. There is going to be increasing demand over the coming years. There's already been an increase in demand over the last 10 years, and you can see the dramatic increase in China and India outstripping everybody else, apart from maybe Nigeria proportionally, to a massive extent. And you can really see that that's underpinned by the growth in middle classes in those countries as well. And I think that's something that we can expect to see going for the next few years. But then we can also see the likes of China are developing their own domestic higher education systems and wanting to become a net importer of students. And then moving on to slide 21. The other thing we've got here as well, and illustrated by the T&E chart from HESA, is that when there are new locations of demand, there may be new geographical concentrations. And this slide is this is drawn from the Hong Kong authorities' website of UK providers with courses in Hong Kong. And I mean, I've got 53 listed here. This was apparently correct as of April 2011, and it just sort of illustrates the number of UK institutions who are already out there in Hong Kong, setting up provision in partnership with local universities or other providers. And it may be illustrative of a trend that's coming in the future. And I suppose one of the questions we need to ask, is Hong Kong is one place, where are the other places? Where might these new patterns of demand emerge from? What we also see as well is there are 20 Australian institutions in that location as well. That's primarily focused on teaching. Slide 22 starts looking at global research as well. And there's a report out during 2011 from the Royal Society that was looking at where the future of research and where the future of research lies and the importance of networks. And that's a very interesting piece. Is about regional networking between different countries and where their sort of spheres of influence were. And may not necessarily been surprised by very many of them. But one of the key headlines that came out of that was this shift towards a multipolar research world. But interestingly, this chap, a guy called Oliver from Science Metrics, put together a bibliometric analysis of research collaborations based on their database, and he produced this just after someone had done a similar sort of thing with the Facebook connections, where it illustrated the friendships of everyone on Facebook and where different regions and countries linked up. And what I find quite interesting about this one is that all the old traditional sort of locations of research endeavour, I guess, that you might expect are there, but the extent to which the old world Europe, it continues to be, the epicentre of a lot of these research networks, and the degree to which China doesn't necessarily, doesn't have that same intensity. Now, this may be, a product of the database itself and the language that it's being produced in, the subject matters that it covers, but then it also illustrates as well that when thinking about a university strategy and where it is that you want to invest, in that, is it China, if it's research that you're interested in, that is the place to be going to at present, or is it in old world Europe still? I don't know. It's something to bear in mind, and there may be other locations, there may be other ways that you want to look at it, but if anything, it's just an interesting picture. It gives a little bit of a sense about, where the connections are being made around the world at present, and, something to bear in mind into the future. But what we became aware of when looking at all of these points, if you're going to try and develop your T&E activities overseas and develop the partnerships that are needed to do that, if you're going to develop the expertise to set up, new locations in places such as Hong Kong or, more complicated parts of the world, that may not have the same sort of cultural links as Hong Kong. And if you're trying to develop, sort of strategies, long-term strategies to develop research partnerships with institutions and organisations in other parts of the world, to really tap into the sort of the creative and research enterprise, that is going on outside of the UK and also in the UK, that there are significant challenges for institutions themselves. And these are just some of the points that came out for us that are illustrated on slide 23. And but what we did sort of wonder, it's a question of your positioning, it's a question of the amount of investment that you're able to get. And it's also to a degree a question of what you might call your brand as well. Being able to develop these sorts of partnerships and be able to enter into new markets or develop new academic and research relationships as well, which I guess got us thinking about research. And one of the big factors facing higher education at present is one of the big talking points, I guess, is in relation to research concentration. And slide 24 illustrates where we are going at present. I don't know whether that affects your institution or not, and you may find that this isn't something that necessarily talks to you. But there's also, there's the second slide on slide 25 that also looks at the continued shift in balance of research funding. Now again, I don't really know, maybe we're moving from a grant-based system, maybe we're moving to a contract-based system. Although, of course, when it comes to contracts, in practice, the bottom right-hand slide, the bottom right-hand corner of that slide still indicates we're dealing with public sector contracts. But what it does sort of show is that maybe there are opportunities out there, but it also shows that the science budget allocation is also flatlining. What that means for your institution and your ability to develop your own strategies is something that needs to be explored. But what we also move on to, I think, and this is one of the big factors that has been talked about around the sector, whatever the sector may be, are new financial models. And Universities UK recently produced the Efficiencies and Modernisation Report. And, when talking about market liberalisation and market discipline, what do we start talking about? We start talking about efficiencies. We start talking about costs and hollowing out functions. We start talking about what are your models of funding, where are the private revenues, and what aspects of your asset base are you able to actually monetize, generate new forms of, new cash flow out of, and how do you become an investment-driven organisation even? These are just some of the points of discussion that are made. So slide 27 gives you a picture of the not-for-profit financial model in the United States. Basic breakdown. It depends on what that speaks to you, really. One of the interesting points that stands out to me is that this one here shows an investment return making up 5% of their revenue by a full-time student. But what's worth bearing in mind is this is in 07-08. This is in the final year before the Lehman's collapse. In the previous years, in the small print at the bottom of the slide, in 2006-07, 19,852. The following year, that became in 08-09, that becomes a loss of £20,000. I don't know. Maybe that's what your organisations look like, but maybe it's not. But that's the not-for-profit financial model in the US for the sector. Moving on, here's the US for-profit financial model. And the difference is really quite stark, as I'm sure you can pick up straight away. So slide 28 we're on now. Tuition and fees, 88% of all the revenue. And then that's basically turned straight around into student services, academic and institutional support. Now this isn't disaggregated in the figures that we have, unfortunately, so it'd be very interesting to see what really gets included in that. But that's all your institutional functions, sort of academic HR support, and all your student services, that side of things, whilst instruction only accounts for 21% of their expenditure, and the others are pretty nominal, really. Which is, again, is an interesting point, and I think that's probably the model that we're going to be looking at for for-profit providers in the United Kingdom. There are a couple of hidden slides there as well that compare, for the last year, 08-09, the income and revenue streams of the for-profit, the not-for-profit and the public four-year institutions. So that's revenue per student and expenditure per student that you can also look at if you find those of interest. But I guess really when we start talking about the for-profit providers, there's the point about new entrants and for-profit entrants. So moving on to slide 31, when talking about the entry of for-profit providers, obviously the big example, the big case study is the University of Phoenix in the United States, who are owned by the Apollo Group, who also own BPP here in the UK. Now their model is very interesting to us. We've already seen the financial profile of that sector, but what we know about the University of Phoenix is, there's online provision mainly with sort of local local learning centres. There's no tenured professors, staff are paid to teach people by classes or by module. There's aggressive recruitment and a very large marketing budget. 20% of the Apollo Group's £1.3 billion net revenue, and it's a phenomenon, the amount of advertising on the internet particularly for University of Phoenix, and their ability to recruit people who wouldn't otherwise have been to university, including from amongst the forces. Now there's been use of sort of public aid schemes. And there's also been some controversy about recruitment, not necessarily by University of Phoenix, but by other providers as well. But I mean, what this really equates to, and I think this figure is very stark, you know, they've gone from 25,000 students in 1995 through to nearly half, 455,000 enrolled students in 2010. I mean, that's staggering growth. Where they sit within the UK, well, I mean, I think that's something for individual institutions to reflect on. Whether they present a challenge, whether they offer the same as you, I don't know. But what we do see here is their heavy use of online. And, you know, what is it about online? You know, we've had the recent HEFKE reports about online learning. And some people in the technology world often talk about decades of disappointment, where, you know, you have a technology and people anticipate its take-up and people using it, but actually, you know, for the first decade or so, nothing really happens, but then you experience a take-off. I don't know if we're there yet, but, you know, we can see it being developed in, you know, continuous professional development, and particularly in T&E. It's very useful there. Other factors we also see, you know, this cloud computing business, and, you know, that may actually sort of see quite a significant change in the way that we use online technologies as organisations, and also as learning tools as well. There's a degree to which, you know, tools like Facebook, I don't use Facebook admittedly, but, you know, you'll end up being able to have sort of video conferencing on that, and the degree to which lecturers and, you know, tutors are already using that sort of technology and bringing those into organisations, you know, sort of a bottom-up adaptation, I guess, of, you know, pre-existing technologies, you know, rather than, you know, the university having to invest in massive infrastructure itself. But then, I guess, you know, when you start talking about learning and new methods of learning and the role of online, you need to ask, you know, how is it that people are using online? You know, the degree to which, you know, students, you know, are growing up with, you know, this Web 2.0 generation, I guess we talk about, and the degree to which that, you know, requires a change in methods. You know, how is it that you navigate information? How is it that you impart knowledge? How is it that you share and produce classes together online? But one of the other things that I think is very significant about this, and this also comes back to the idea of market liberalisation. Moving on to slide 33, is this concept of unbundling. It's something that gets talked about when talking about market liberalisation. It's about how you produce a product, and it's also about how you take that product and unbundle it. You know, it means that you may have, you know, different providers sat behind a brand, you know, and so the consumer sort of is purchasing one product, but it's being provided by many different companies and organisations in a very sort of complex production line, I guess. Or alternatively, it's about the product as well, and it's about unbundling what that product is. You know, is it this idea of buying different classes and, you know, different modules and being able to access your own resources and just go and getting an exam? And I mean, I think we thought that, you know, there are already examples of this going on, and of course, you know, New College of the Humanities is already there, but it you know, throws up other interesting challenges as well. I mean, about intellectual property and curriculum and the likes. But, you know, I think this is something that's worth exploring a little bit more. I think we can definitely see that in the current round of reforms. I think, you know, some of the examples on this slide, you know, non-teaching degree awarding powers, you know, module by module sort of provision, you know, free educational resources, you know, different providers on campus, you know, actually teaching students who are registered at a university. You know, all of these are sort of examples of how the concept of a higher education is being, you know, unbundled, let's say, from the consumer's point of view, but also from the producer's point of view. And the challenges that also brings to an institution and what they do. I mean, there's a lot there, really, to take in, and not all of it, you know, I'm definitely not expert on very, very much of it even, but what we felt these were some of the factors that, you know, were worth considering and were interesting points that could generate discussion amongst the group. But one of the other factors I think that is also worth bearing in mind, you know, if we think back to how other sectors have changed over the last 30 years as a tool to get us thinking really critically about how much higher education might change over the next 30 years, I think it's also worth considering about how the people might change who are within higher education. Now, I speak as, you know, one of the first generations to have had to pay fees for higher education, and I know that, you know, my contemporaries and colleagues are now, moving into the academic workforce. So increasingly, you've got a profile of people who have paid fees moving into the academic workforce. And also you've got, progressively over time, those people who have been brought up on internet-based communications moving into the academic workforce and then eventually taking up leadership positions in 30 years or so's time. That's not to say there's not new technologies that come out. It's not even to say that maybe there isn't going to be a reaction against the idea of paying fees for universities. But what it does mean is that, the worldview and the understanding that people have about technology and the role in people's lives, and that the relationship between a student as a consumer and university and the role of fees in that may well be changing over the next few years. What the implications for that are, I don't know. And that, again, is something for the group to discuss. We've talked a lot about factors that are shaping the organisation of higher education and universities, and the factors that may change how people are taught, how people want to be taught, how the locations of universities might shift, the challenges that brings, and then also how it is that you may be able to maximise revenues or investments, and direct that into improving the product or the institution and your ability to strive for excellence effectively. But then there's also other big questions as well that speak to higher education, and the search for knowledge and these kind of big agendas. And it's captured here on the next slide, which is slide 35. What is the next big agenda? What are the factors that are going to be shaping the work of universities over the next 10, 20, 30 years? Is it climate change? Is this the big thing? Is it aging? Is it global economic development? Is it going to be the rise of China, or is that all a little bit overblown? I don't know. But it's something worthwhile for universities to consider, because maybe it affects the way that you see your work and where you prioritise your work. Again, there's a lot there. There's one final slide, just to sort of throw up some initial questions on slide 36. I hope some of the examples and some of the information that we've put up there are of interest to the group. I hope that it provides an opportunity for people to really sort of sit down and think critically about where we are and the factors that are shaping higher education. And really it's intended as, it's a prop. It's a prop to try and generate discussion for people. And really, it's something that can be tested, and there may be parts of it that you fundamentally disagree with. It is one picture of the factors that are shaping higher education. It's not even necessarily a picture that we like. It is one version that is maybe set within 2011, and in a couple of years' time it may look very, very different. But it hopefully has given you something to consider, reflect on, and hopefully has generated some conversation that can then support the latter parts of the exercise and your future work.